Sources can be both written documents and artifacts, and both types can inform us about the past. An artifact, such as any utensil, gives us knowledge about how human beings have created things and using it in the kitchen through the centuries. From old terracotta and clay to modern ceramic or steel ones. Any building is also a source. It reflects understanding of what makes a building so strong that it is even standing today for us as a source. The source can be an old biography or an old historical record. The sources are to help us get as close as possible to the event. Types of sources. Artifacts. Human remains, pottery, weapons, tools, coins, and art writing, including inscriptions carved in stone and writing on walls, papyrus, clay, wood, and paper, are artifacts. Oral histories transmitted from generations to generations or recorded in paintings, dances, and ceremonies are also the sources. Written records. These include contemporary letters, eyewitness accounts, official records, political declarations and decrees, administrative texts, and histories and biographies written during the time to be studied. Historians may use any of these written documents to find out about the past. They may not have been created for that reason, but they are still very useful. Oral history. Oral history is the compilation and analysis of historical details about people, families, significant events, or daily life through audio tapes, videotapes, or transcripts of scheduled interviews. These interviews are conducted with people who have participated in or witnessed past events and whose memoirs and impressions of past events are to be preserved as an oral archive for future generations. Oral history attempts to gather knowledge from a range of viewpoints, much of which cannot be found in written documents. Visual sources. Photos, paintings, drawings, cartoons, posters, films, videos, advertisements, and three-dimensional art such as sculpture and architecture can all be interpreted as a part of the visual record. Some visual resources are one-of-a-kind works, while others are reproduced like prints or illustrations in books and magazines. Primary sources. A primary source is an original object or document. It is the first-hand information. Primary sources are materials written or produced in the time period that you may be investigating. Primary sources enable the researcher to get as close as possible to what actually happened during an historical event or time period. It contains original information that has not been interpreted, evaluated, paraphrased, or condensed. Such sources are usually created during or very close to the time of the events they report on. The author of a primary source typically provides direct impressions of events he or she is reporting on. Kinds of primary sources. Diaries and journals. For example, Anne Frank was a teenager during World War II. She kept a diary or journal the years before she died in a concentration camp. Her diary was later published as the Diary of Anne Frank. This is a primary source. Autobiographies. An autobiography is when you write a story or book about yourself. For example, Nelson Mandela wrote his autobiography about events in his life called Long Walk of Freedom. The autobiography of Nelson Mandela is a primary document because he wrote his first-hand experiences like Tujhe Babri. Speeches are considered primary sources. For example, speeches of Vivekanand, Nehru, Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King. All these speeches are primary sources. Historical documents such as the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution are primary documents. They were drafted and signed. Other primary sources are birth certificates, government records, deeds, court documents, military records, tax records, census records, artworks, treatises, policies, drafts, and unpublished journals. Sound recordings and interviews are considered primary sources. Photographs and videos are also called primary sources. Letters are considered primary sources. For example, soldiers during wars wrote to their families about war events they experienced. Secondary sources. Secondary sources provide second-hand information. Secondary sources are often written well after the events they report on and can put past information into its historical context. A secondary source is something written about a primary source. Secondary sources are written after the fact that is at a later date. Usually, the author of a secondary source will have studied the primary sources of an historical period or event and will then interpret the evidence found in these sources. That is how secondary sources are considered second-hand information. Although they can be useful and reliable, they cannot reflect what people who lived at that time thought or felt about the event. But they can represent a more fair account of the event because they can include more than one point of view or may include information that was unavailable at the time of the event. Kinds of secondary sources: textbooks, biographies, histories, newspaper report by someone who was not present, charts, graphs, or images created after the time, or editorials are the secondary sources. Relevance of sources. There are no good or bad sources. Whether a source is relevant or not depends on what you would like to get to know from it. For example, if you want to know how people suffered during partition, an eyewitness account by a survivor would be a good source. However, her account about what administration was doing at that time and what were the political situations may not be as good. So it is your question, what you want to know, that determines whether the source is relevant for you or not. Now the question arises, what is more reliable, secondary source or primary source? Like Abu Fazl's Akbarnama is a primary source, but there could be a lot of bias because it has been written by a patronized writer. In such a case, a well-researched secondary source including all the perspectives can be more reliable. Relic and narrative. All historical sources are relics. This means that all sources are the result of a certain action, of the attitude of the creator and of the time the source was created. For example, the memoir of British officer during colonialism is a result of his daily accounts in a book, and we can know about a lot of things about his role in politics, motive behind his actions or his policies, and it is called narrative apart from his daily life. So you can utilize the source as a relic or a narrative. It depends on what you want to use the source for. Again, what you want to find out. For instance, if you want to know about Akbar, we have Akbarnama, but there are plenty of other things that Abul Fazl tried to write during his reign. He starts from history even before Akbar. So we have to ask few questions to ourselves as a historian, like what type of source it is. Is it a letter, a diary, a law instructions, or what? The type of source can explain why it contains the information it does. Who has created the source and why? Is the content biased? Did the creator have a special motive for writing the narrative, and is the source influenced by his or her motive? Always we have to take into consideration whether the creator of the source can exaggerate or alter the truth. We need to ask, when was the source created? Notice when the source was written. Was it written down close to the event or many years later? If it was written a long time after the event took place, there is a risk that the creator of the source has forgotten what actually happened or does not have the complete information about what has happened. Another question we can ask is it a primary or a secondary source? Investigate whether the source has copied its information from another source, like the story of Herodotus, the Greek historian who in the 5th century wrote about events that had taken place several hundred years before he was born. Where did Herodotus get this information from? He must have had it told to him or have copied from other sources. We call the oldest known variant of a source the primary source. If the source is a copy or relics on another source, it is a secondary source because it is based on the primary source. It is important to know this because just imagine if the secondary source has copied wrongly from the primary source. This is why it is a good idea to go to the primary source if it still exists. If it does not exist anymore, then the copy suddenly becomes the primary source because it has now become the oldest known variant of the source. Is the information first-hand or second-hand? Whom is the source addressed to? Pay attention to the recipient of the source. The creators of the sources may have had an interest in writing because they knew who would read it? Is the source backed by other sources? One source is not enough to explain the past. After all, the information in the source may not be correct. There are often several different accounts that tell us about the same event. Like, apart from Akbarnama, Badayuni's account are very, very important to know the time of Akbar. External and internal criticism of the source. External source criticism analyzes the nature of the source, its origin and purpose, when, where, by whom, in what context and or environment, on which basis, in what form, for whom, and with which intention was the source produced. Is it a primary or secondary source? How can it be used? Normative or cognitive, descriptive, or both? Is it directed towards the past, the present, or the future, the way it was, is, or is to be? Is it public or private, formal or informal? Is it non-performative or performative? Internal source criticism. It analyzes the relationship between the source and its subject matter. Is it first hand, second hand, third hand, or what? What is its closeness in terms of time to what it speaks about? What is its ability, possibility, or will to speak trustworthy about the matter of interest? Does it have a specific tendency or bias on agenda of its own? Is it descriptive, persuasive, or neutral? If you want to know anything about history or historiography, please leave it in the comment box so that I can come back with it. If you have liked the episode, please like, share, and subscribe. Thank you.